When a wife walked in on a betrayal too monstrous to comprehend, what followed would leave a trail of blood, heartbreak, and unanswered questions. In the quiet suburban town of Keller, Texas, where the streets were lined with oak trees and neatly manicured lawns, the life of Officer Michael Turner had always seemed like one of respect and admiration. He was known in the community as a dedicated cop, a man of integrity, and a loving husband to his wife Emily. To those who knew him, Michael's life appeared picture-perfect, but all of that was about to shatter on the morning of June 14, 2023. It began like any other day, or so it seemed. Michael had left for work before the sun had fully risen, as he did every morning. Emily, a stay-at-home mom, had already started her day caring for their 13-year-old daughter Clara, who had special needs. Clara, born with a developmental delay, had a heart full of love, but was unable to express herself fully. Emily had dedicated her life to Clara's care, managing everything from doctor appointments to daily therapies. The bond between mother and daughter was unbreakable. Emily's routine had always been predictable. She would prepare breakfast for Clara, help her get dressed, and then spend the day keeping Clara entertained, ensuring her safety and assisting with the challenges she faced every day. Despite the hardship, Emily never complained. She was, above all, patient and loving, and in those moments of calm, she often reflected on the life she had built with Michael. They had been married for almost 15 years, and although their marriage wasn't without its struggles, it had always seemed stable. That was, until that fateful day. As morning passed into afternoon, Emily began to feel uneasy. It was an odd sensation, one she couldn't place but couldn't ignore. Clara was playing in her room with her dolls, her laughter soft and innocent, and yet Emily felt the tension growing inside her. She moved from room to room, checking the windows, the doors, her mind racing for no apparent reason. Everything was fine on the surface, yet there was something she couldn't shake. It was around 3 p.m. when the tension in the house reached its peak. Michael's patrol car had not yet returned from his shift, and Emily began to feel a knot tighten in her stomach. She dismissed the feeling as paranoia. After all, Michael had always been diligent with his work. Perhaps there had been a delay. Still, her unease persisted. What Emily didn't know was that Michael had come home early that afternoon, under circumstances he hadn't planned for. Michael had pulled into the driveway, his thoughts clouded with guilt. The events of the morning had left him conflicted. For weeks now, Michael had been struggling with something he couldn't admit to himself, let alone to Emily. He had been seeing someone behind his wife's back, someone he never expected to cross paths with. Her name was Jessica, a young woman he had met while working a late shift. They had developed a bond that Michael had convinced himself was harmless at first, but soon it had spiraled into something more, something he couldn't control. It had been a secret he carried with him, one he tried to justify with lies to himself and his wife. But deep down, he knew it was wrong. It was tearing him apart, and when he saw Clara's innocent face earlier that day, the guilt had overwhelmed him. The truth, however, wasn't so easily hidden. Michael's plan had been to return home, pretend everything was normal, and carry on as if his infidelity didn't exist. But the weight of his actions had become too much. He knew he couldn't live with the secret any longer. He needed to confess to Emily, tell her everything, and face the consequences of his betrayal. Little did he know that Emily, sensing something was wrong, had made a decision of her own. Over the last few weeks, she had noticed small changes in Michael's behavior, things that didn't quite add up. The late nights, the long shifts that seemed to have no end, the distance between them when they spoke. Emily had asked herself if she had been too trusting, too wrapped up in Clara's care to notice the cracks forming in her marriage. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. As Michael entered the house, his heart heavy with the burden of his secret, he was unaware that Emily had already begun her own investigation. She had found a text message on his phone earlier that day, something that couldn't be ignored. The message was brief, but it left little to the imagination. "I miss you. We can't keep doing this." Emily's world came crashing down at that moment. Her hands trembled as she read it again, but the truth was undeniable. She couldn't unsee it. Michael had been lying to her. He had betrayed her trust. Emily had no idea what to do with the overwhelming wave of emotion that had taken over her. Her initial reaction was to confront him, to demand answers, but as the minutes passed, something more unsettling took hold. Rage. Hurt. The realization that everything she had believed in, everything she had sacrificed for, was built on lies. She stood frozen in the hallway, watching as Michael walked through the door. He didn't see her at first. Clara's laughter echoed from the other room, and the sound was a cruel reminder of the life they had built together. A life that was about to be destroyed by the truth. Without warning, Emily moved quickly toward the kitchen, where Michael was about to enter. She had grabbed the gun from the locked drawer, something she had never imagined she would use. She didn't plan on it, not really, but the pain and betrayal clouded her thoughts, leaving her with only one course of action in her mind. As Michael turned to face her, his expression faltering as he saw the gun in her hands, Emily's world shattered. She could see the realization dawn on his face. He knew she knew, and in that instant, everything in their lives seemed to collapse. In a blur of emotion and rage, Emily fired the gun. The sound was deafening. The shot echoed through the house, its sharp crack slicing through the still air like a thunderclap. Michael didn't even have time to react. The bullet found its mark, striking him in the chest, sending him staggering backward into the wall. His body collapsed to the floor, the weight of the wound forcing him to his knees. Blood quickly pooled beneath him, a stark contrast against the polished wooden floor. Emily stood frozen, her hand still clutching the gun, her mind struggling to comprehend the gravity of what she had just done. The weapon felt foreign in her grip, yet the surge of emotion that had led her to pull the trigger seemed to make sense in that moment. Anger, betrayal, and despair had all coalesced into a single, irreversible action. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours, as Emily stared at her husband, who was now on the floor, his breaths shallow and labored. His once proud and sturdy frame was crumpled, his life rapidly draining from him. The sight of Michael in such a vulnerable state sent a shiver of realization through her, yet it did nothing to quell the fury that still churned within her. And then, in the midst of the silence that followed, Emily heard a faint sound coming from the next room. Clara's voice, calling her name, faint but insistent. Her heart lurched as she remembered that her daughter was only a few feet away, unaware of the horrors unfolding just beyond the door. Emily turned, her mind briefly consumed with the urgency of the situation. She didn't know what to do next. Part of her wanted to run, to flee the consequences of her actions, but another part of her remained rooted to the spot, unable to leave the man who had once been her everything. Michael's life was slipping away, and yet there was something inside her that wanted to know how this would all end. Would he survive? Would he plead for his life, beg her for forgiveness? Would there be some shred of hope left to salvage their broken marriage? But as the blood continued to spill from his wound, Michael's movements became slower, weaker. His chest rose and fell with increasing difficulty, and Emily could see the life draining from him, piece by piece. The man she had loved for so long, her partner, her confidant, the father of her child, was slipping from her grasp. A second shot rang out, the deafening noise blurring the space between time and reality. Emily's vision blurred momentarily, her ears ringing with the sound of the gunshot, but when the fog cleared, she realized she had fired again. This time, the shot was for him, for Clara. In the next room, Clara stood, watching the scene unfold, her wide eyes filled with confusion and fear. She had heard the shots and had been drawn to the sound, unsure of what was happening, but instinctively aware that something was terribly wrong. Her small frame trembled as she clutched her stuffed bunny to her chest, the only comfort she could find in the chaos. Emily turned toward her daughter, her heart breaking as she looked at Clara. There was no way to undo what had just happened. There was no way to turn back the clock, to rewrite the events that had brought her to this point. She had lost control, and now the consequences of her actions would stretch far beyond just Michael. Clara's innocent eyes locked with hers, and for a fleeting moment, Emily felt a pang of guilt. She could see the confusion on her daughter's face, the unspoken question of why her mother had done this, but there were no words. There was no explanation that could make sense of it all. Emily's mind raced as she tried to figure out what to do next. Should she try to save Michael? Should she run, escape the mess she had created? She knew she couldn't go back to the life she had before, but the idea of being alone, without Michael, without anyone to share her burden, was almost too much to bear. In the space of just a few minutes, everything had changed. Emily's once perfect life had been shattered beyond repair. Her husband, her love, was dying on the floor in front of her, and her daughter stood helpless, caught in the wake of a decision she couldn't take back. There was no time for hesitation. Emily moved toward Clara, her footsteps slow and heavy, her hands shaking as she lowered the gun to her side. She couldn't bear the thought of Clara seeing the horror any longer. She needed to protect her, to shield her from the aftermath of this tragedy, but the weight of what had just occurred weighed heavily on her heart. The truth can be stranger and darker. What happens when families are shattered, secrets revealed, and the past collides with the present in the most horrifying way? If you're enjoying this documentary, subscribe now. Clara looked up at her mother, a tear tracing down her cheek. Emily knelt before her, wrapping her arms around the young girl, holding her close. At that moment, Emily realized the magnitude of what she had done. She hadn't just taken Michael's life. She had stolen the future she had once envisioned for her daughter. Outside, the sounds of sirens could be heard in the distance, signaling that the quiet suburban neighborhood would soon be filled with the noise of law enforcement, ambulances, and first responders. Emily's time was running out. Her actions were now irrevocable. She could already hear the voices of her neighbors, the murmurs of disbelief, as the events of that afternoon began to unfold in the public eye. The law enforcement community, which Michael had been a part of, would now be called to investigate his death, but Emily already knew what that would mean. She had taken a life, and there would be no escape from the consequences. What began as an unthinkable act, driven by rage, betrayal, and desperation, was now unfolding as the start of a long, painful journey toward justice. Or, perhaps, punishment. As she held Clara, trying to shield her from the chaotic world that had just descended upon them, Emily knew there was no easy answer. Her actions had shattered everything she had ever known, and she could only wait to see how it would all play out. Would she face the consequences of her violence? Or would she somehow find a way to navigate the life that lay ahead? And what of Clara? What kind of future could she have in the wake of her mother's choices? Emily could only wonder, as the sirens grew louder and the inevitable confrontation with the law drew closer. The weight of the decisions she had made was heavy, and the consequences would haunt her for the rest of her life. The heavy scent of blood filled the air as the chaos continued to unfold. Sirens grew louder, closing in on the small suburban neighborhood where a once tranquil afternoon had erupted into horror. Emily sat motionless, her arms around Clara, holding her as if the tight grip might somehow shield them both from the consequences that were quickly approaching. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she couldn't escape the reality of what she had done. The events of the past few minutes seemed like a terrible blur, a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. As Clara's sobs grew quieter in her arms, Emily realized the gravity of the situation. The sirens were no longer a distant sound. They were right outside, moving rapidly through the streets. In the time it took for her to comprehend the depth of the destruction she had caused, law enforcement would arrive, and everything would change. Emily knew there would be no escaping the reality of her actions. She had taken Michael's life, the man she had once vowed to spend forever with, and now there was no going back. Clara shifted slightly in Emily's embrace, pulling away just enough to look up at her mother with questioning eyes. Emily didn't know how to answer her, how to explain why everything had gone so terribly wrong. How could she tell her daughter that the man they had trusted, the father who had raised her, had betrayed them both? How could she explain the way everything had shattered, with no hope of rebuilding the pieces? As the wail of an approaching ambulance pierced the stillness, Emily felt herself retreat further into the haze of guilt and regret. In the back of her mind, she wondered if she could have done something differently. Could she have walked away when she saw Michael with their daughter? Could she have stopped before the rage took over? Could she have saved them all from this tragic ending? But the truth was, it was too late for those questions. The irreversible damage had already been done. The first officer arrived on the scene, his vehicle screeching to a halt in front of the house. His partner followed close behind, their boots hitting the pavement as they rushed toward the open door. Inside, The air was thick with the stench of gunpowder and blood. The scene was nothing short of grisly. Michael's body, motionless on the floor, a pool of blood surrounding him. His face, once full of life, was now a mask of pain, forever frozen in his final moments. The officers stepped cautiously into the room, their hands instinctively going to their holsters as they assessed the situation. But it was Clara's fragile, trembling form that caught the attention of the officers first. The young girl, no older than 13, clung to her mother with a terrified expression on her face. Emily's heart sank as she met the officer's gaze, knowing the truth had to come out now. There was no hiding from the consequences. There was no way to shield Clara from the world she would now be thrust into. The world where her mother had made an unimaginable choice. The officers exchanged a look, their training kicking in as they recognized the gravity of the situation. One of them reached for his radio, relaying the details to dispatch as his partner cautiously approached Emily. The officer spoke in calm, measured tones, though Emily could hear the undercurrent of urgency in his voice. He asked her to lower the gun, still clutched in her hand, the weapon now an anchor to the weight of her actions. Emily hesitated, staring down at the weapon as if it were an extension of her own shattered soul. The gun had been her tool of destruction, and now it was the symbol of her downfall. Her body trembled as she finally let go of the gun, allowing it to fall to the ground with a muffled thud. She felt utterly numb, the emotions of the past few minutes washing over her in waves. But none of them could bring her relief. Nothing could undo what had been done. The officer moved closer, his gaze never leaving her as he carefully placed a hand on her shoulder. "Ma'am, we need to get you away from here. We have to secure the scene." Emily nodded, barely aware of the officer's words. She felt herself being guided away from the room, Clara still clutched tightly in her arms. The young girl's sobs had stopped, leaving only the sound of shallow breaths as she leaned against her mother for comfort. The officer led them into the living room, where they waited, the minutes stretching on as they processed the crime scene in the other room. Emily's mind was a tangled mess of thoughts. She wondered about the life she had known, about how it could all fall apart so quickly. She wondered about Michael, about the love they had shared and the family they had built together. She had never imagined this, never thought that their marriage would end in violence, in bloodshed. And yet, here she was, sitting in the silence of a house that no longer felt like home. She felt a deep sorrow for the child in her arms, for the innocence that had been taken from her by her own mother's actions. She knew that Clara would never be the same again. The bond they had shared would be forever altered. As the minutes ticked by, the police began to ask questions, though they were careful not to rush Emily. They understood the emotional toll the situation had taken on her. The lead investigator stepped into the room, his face a mask of professionalism as he began to question Emily, but she couldn't offer much in the way of answers. Her mind was clouded and her emotions were a jumbled mess. She could only repeat the events in a haze, offering fragmented memories of the day that had started like any other and ended in bloodshed. It wasn't long before more officers arrived, and the house began to fill with the sounds of law enforcement at work. Emily's fate was sealed, and she knew that the rest of her life would be spent trying to make sense of what had happened. The path she had taken, driven by betrayal and anger, had led her to this point, a point from which there was no turning back. She glanced down at Clara, whose face was pale and tear-streaked. The child's wide eyes looked up at her mother, searching for answers that Emily couldn't give. The silence between them was thick, heavy with the weight of everything that had been lost. At that moment, Emily realized that her world had been torn apart. There was no going back, no fixing the damage she had done. And as she sat there, waiting for the inevitable questions to come, she wondered how she would ever find a way to live with the choices she had made. As the hours passed, the house became a place of chilling silence, broken only by the quiet murmur of law enforcement officers processing the scene. Outside, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow across the quiet Texas neighborhood. Inside, however, the air was thick with tension. Emily, still seated in the living room, had barely moved since the police arrived. Her body was stiff, as though the gravity of her actions had rooted her in place. Clara remained by her side, now wrapped in a blanket, her face pale from the shock that had yet to wear off. The house, once a symbol of normalcy and family, now felt like a cold, foreign space. The furniture, the walls, the memories, they were all contaminated by the violence that had unfolded here. Emily's mind seemed to race in circles, unable to find any sense of peace or understanding. She felt the weight of her own guilt pressing down on her chest, squeezing the breath out of her. She thought of Michael, her husband, lying lifeless on the floor in the next room. Her stomach churned at the thought, and yet there was no escape from it. Her mind replayed the events over and over. How she had walked into that room, how she had seen the unthinkable, the sight of her husband, her partner, with their daughter. Her 13-year-old, innocent and vulnerable child. The anger that had surged inside her, the uncontrollable rage that had boiled over, was still fresh in her memory. In a moment of blind fury, she had acted without thinking, without considering the consequences, and now here she was, trapped in this endless cycle of regret, waiting for a fate she could neither control nor escape. The officers worked methodically, careful not to disturb the crime scene. The investigator in charge had asked Emily the same questions repeatedly, trying to piece together the story from her fragmented responses. But Emily couldn't offer much. She had no answers for the questions that gnawed at her. The questions of why her husband had crossed the line, why he had betrayed their family in such an unimaginable way. The officer, who had been speaking with her, seemed to recognize her confusion, her inability to make sense of the events. He softened his tone, speaking to her like she was still a human being rather than a suspect. But Emily could hardly hear his words. Her thoughts were clouded with shame, sorrow, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness. She wished she could take it all back, rewind time, and undo the violence that had shattered her family, but it was too late for that. Outside, more officers arrived, their footsteps echoing through the yard as they moved to secure the perimeter. Emily barely registered their presence. She was trapped in her own mind, reliving the moment of violence, the moment when everything had gone wrong. She thought of Clara, who sat beside her, her small body trembling from the emotional strain. Emily couldn't bring herself to speak to her, not now. She was too lost in her own anguish to offer any comfort. The child had witnessed the unthinkable, and Emily couldn't even begin to process the damage that had been done. The hours passed slowly, like days dragging on. Emily's eyes were heavy, her head pounding, and she felt as though she might collapse from exhaustion. But no amount of rest could undo what had happened. Her body felt heavy with the weight of her actions, and no amount of time would make the pain go away. The door to the living room opened briefly, and one of the officers stepped inside. He looked at Emily for a moment, his expression unreadable, before speaking softly. "We need to take you in, ma'am." Emily didn't resist. She didn't protest. There was nothing left to say. She stood up, slowly, feeling the floor beneath her shift beneath her feet. Clara, still holding the blanket tightly around her shoulders, looked up at her mother with a silent, searching gaze. Emily felt her heart crack under the weight of her daughter's innocent eyes, but she said nothing. What could she say? There was nothing left to say. The life she had known was over, and there was no going back. As the officer guided Emily toward the door, another officer entered the living room, holding a small notepad in his hand. He was young, no older than 25, but his eyes were sharp and calculating. He looked at Emily for a moment, his gaze steady before speaking. "We'll be taking your daughter to the station, Mum. She'll be cared for." Emily nodded absently. The words barely registered in her mind. She knew what was happening, but it felt as if she were detached from her own body, watching herself move through the motions like a spectator. She followed the officer to the car, her feet dragging, each step heavier than the last. Clara, once more in the care of the authorities, was escorted to a separate vehicle. Emily glanced at her daughter one last time before the car door was shut, the sound echoing in her ears like a death knell. The officers led her to a squad car, and as the door slammed shut behind her, Emily finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of the consequences of her actions. She had lost everything: her husband, her family, and her future. She didn't know what the days ahead would hold, but she knew one thing for certain. She would never escape the memory of that moment, that split second when her rage had overpowered everything else. The ride to the station was silent. Emily didn't speak, and neither did the officer in the front seat. The city around her seemed distant, as though it were part of another world, a world where she no longer belonged. As the car rolled through the streets, Emily could only think of Clara. The child would be taken care of for now, but what would become of her? Would she ever forgive her mother? Would she ever understand what had led to the violence that had torn their family apart? The questions circled in Emily's mind, but she couldn't find any answers. There were no easy answers to this. There would be no escaping the aftermath of what she had done. The road ahead would be long and uncertain. And as the squad car made its way toward the station, Emily couldn't help but wonder if there was any way to make things right again, or if it was already too late. Want more twisted tales and unsolved mysteries? Subscribe now and never miss another jaw-dropping chapter of true crime stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat.